Okay. So again, welcome. I'm Chris Altrock, the senior minister of the Stamford Church of Christ. And with us tonight are Rabbi Joshua Hammerman and Stephanie Clary. Joshua Hammerman, a celebrated rabbi and award-winning journalist, author, and blogger, has served Temple Bethel in Stamford, Connecticut for over 3 decades. As Temple Bethel's spiritual leader, he's focused his efforts on creating an oasis of warmth, love, and mutual respect, befitting the role of a modern congregation in an increasingly complex world. Rabbi Hammerman was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1983 after receiving a master's degree in journalism from NYU and a BA magna cum laude from Brown University, where he twice won the university's prestigious Bishop McVicker Prize in Religious Studies. He came to Temple Bethel as its assistant rabbi in 1987 and became senior rabbi in 1992. In 2010, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from JTS for his years of service to the Jewish people. His most recent book, Embracing Auschwitz, Forging a Vibrant, Life-Affirming Judaism that Takes the Holocaust Seriously, has been hailed as by far the most original book on the Holocaust that has come along in a great many years. And then Stephanie Clary is the environment editor at Earthbeat, a project of the National Catholic Reporter that shares stories about the climate crisis, faith, and action. In 2021, she co-led the communication track at Creighton University's Laudato Si and the U.S. Catholic Churches Conference while working as the digital editor at U.S. Catholic Magazine. Prior to her roles in national Catholic journalism, Clary helped coordinate the implementation of Laudato Si in the Roman Catholic Diocese of Burlington, Vermont, including the statewide Diocese Year of Creation programming and the Action for Ecological Justice Conference at St. Michael's College in 2017. Her writing appears in various publications, including Vermont Catholic Magazine, Millennial Journal, Catholic News Service, U.S. Catholic Magazine, National Catholic Reporter, and the Journal of Religion and Film. She's given talks and presentations on the church and creation care to Catholic, ecumenical, and interfaith groups, including the 2022 commencement speech at College of St. Mary's in Omaha, Nebraska. Clary holds bachelor's degrees in communication studies and religious studies from St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, and a master's degree in systematic theology from Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And we welcome her from Clary Studios in Chicago today. So Stephanie, we'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this evening. I'm really happy to be here. As you can see, my home office is also in my youngest child's bedroom. So I really appreciate the flexibility to join you virtually. While it would have been very nice to meet some of you in person that are there around the tables, this works out really well. And let me see if I can share you a quick picture of them. I thought I'd show you. There they are. So this is a picture from my youngest son's baptism last month. They don't really like pictures, but there they are.
Beautiful.
It's Theo, Callum, and Liam. So they're downstairs with Dad while we do this, and hopefully will not be making an appearance in this room. So I was told there's not a lot of Catholics active in this interfaith council, which is a super disappointing thing, because for me, although it did sound like there's a few former Catholics when you guys were introducing yourselves. So I don't know if we get to claim you or not, but for me, interfaith and ecumenical spaces have always been a huge part of my Catholicism. I was born Catholic, but then got more engaged as I got a little bit older. And I've just been really fortunate to participate in different ways in interfaith groups as I've delved deeper into theology, and then especially as I've gotten deeper into the faith and climate spaces. It's just such a fertile ground for interfaith work. Just this morning, the Pope met with an interfaith group from England. I was talking about throwaway culture and protecting creation. So that was a really well-timed story for me this morning preparing for this event. It's just been one of my favorite places to do this work, and one of the things I really hoped to emphasize at Earthbeat when I joined the National Catholic Reporter a little over a year ago. It's something they were always doing, but we do have some projects coming up that really focus on interfaith and ecumenical relations. So I'll mention those at the end, but they might be of interest for this group to kind of keep their eye out for. So I thought I would talk a little bit about how I got interested in the care for creation aspect of Catholicism, and then kind of briefly go over where the Catholic Church is like situated today with all of this. Highlight a couple things that are happening more on the ground, and then leave the rest to Q&A. So happy to talk more about any of that or other things during the Q&A portion. But for me, I made my way into like the climate space very directly because of my theological studies. When I was getting my graduate degree at Catholic Theological Union, I took a course on feminist perspectives in biblical studies and theology. And each week of that course looked at kind of a different section of intersectional feminism. So like how feminism relates to different issues in the world. And one of those weeks on ecofeminism, on ecofeminist theology. So we read Phyllis Tribble and Phyllis Bird for scripture, and we read Rosemary Radford Ruther and Elizabeth Johnson for theology. And this is like notably a very white syllabus at the time we were doing it, which would probably be different now. But reading these things showed me a way to look at my faith that I had not seen before. And I mean, I was cradle Catholic, went to, CCD my whole life, and my parents were involved in parish life, but it was just not a way I had ever been taught to look at certain scripture stories or, feast days or rituals. And it really resonated for me because that big picture view of the same logic that is used to oppress different people. So in this class, we were looking at how like men would oppress women, but you could apply it to anything. That same logic is used for humans to dominate nature. And it doesn't lead to a fruitful life in any of these situations. It doesn't honor the dignity and creation in any of these situations. And so this just really resonated with the Catholic worldview I had been taught, but not in these terms. And so really from that day on, I kind of just adopted the eco-theology as the framework that I viewed all the other theology through in my personal and my professional life. It just made sense for me. It would lead to understandings that were more in line with justice to me and more in line with morality. So it just seemed like that was a great way to look at things to align with my Catholicism. So I took it on as my research topic during my grad work. And then after grad school, I taught Catholic high school for a bit. And then I worked at a Catholic diocese in the communication office. Then I worked at US Catholic. And in none of those jobs focused my work, like my job description wasn't care for creation or Laudato Si or ecology, but I would find ways to fit it in. And that led to when NCR was looking for a new environment editor. I just knew that like I had to throw my name in the ring. I had not been at US Catholic very long, so it was kind of a tough decision, but I knew if I had the chance to focus on this every day, that was something I wanted to do, because it was basically what I'd been trying to convince my bosses to let me do for years in all these other jobs. And, they let me to some extent, but it was just really great to land here, such a perfect position for some of the past projects I had been able to be a part of. It just really prepared me for this. And I just feel really lucky that I get to do this every day. And there's so many more stories we could tell, but we average about 4 stories per week on Earthbeat, not always about Catholic and climate, but about any sort of faith-based story and climate, or Catholic reactions to broader climate news, like the IPCC reports, or different things like that. So it's been a really exciting time to work in the media of faith and climate news, not just because of Pope Francis, but especially because of Pope Francis. But I was actually so when I was in grad school was during the time when Benedict resigned and Francis came into the picture. So it was pre-Laudato Si. I was obviously very excited when Laudato Si came out. But that level of like concise doctrine on the topic didn't exist yet. And something that I was actually surprised to learn after the fact was that when people referred to the Green Pope, that was actually a name that was given to Pope Benedict XVI. Yeah, I know, fun fact, good trivia fact. So my colleague here at NCR, our environment correspondent, Brian Rowe, he has been part of Earthbeat since it was launched in 2019, and is just like a wealth of knowledge on all things Catholic climate news. And he did a story when Benedict resigned that kind of looked back at the, what Benedict had contributed to the environmental theology of the church. And I'm happy to share any of these links either like at the end, or I could send them in an email later to be distributed if you want these specific articles. But so Brian did a story both when Benedict resigned and then again more recently when Benedict died, kind of looking at his impact on this part of the church teaching. And so a few of the things that are mentioned in those reports are that it was under Benedict's reign that the Vatican declared pollution among the social sins impacting the modern world. We'll later see Pope Francis say he's going to add ecological sin to the catechism as a type of sin, but it was Benedict who first declared pollution as a social sin. During the Benedict papacy, he emphasized that creation is a gift and that humans have a responsibility to steward it appropriately, which is like a slight shift from saying like it's a resource for us to use, so a gift for us to steward properly. He advocated for international climate treaties and renewable energy technologies and directed attention at environmental refugees. Climate refugees actually still don't have a lot of the protection other refugees have in the world, and that's something that Pope Francis has been recently speaking about as well, because they are an increasing percentage of those who are being displaced from their homes are because of climate issues. Benedict's 2010 World Day of Peace message was titled, "If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation." He recognized that industrialized nations had a greater responsibility to adopt sustainable lifestyles than did the more vulnerable countries around the world. Again, something Francis picks up and kind of develops further. And it was in 2008 that Benedict oversaw the installation of 2,400 solar panels on the roof of the Paul VI Auditorium in Vatican City. So if you ever see those pictures that are like just the huge solar scape with kind of like the St. Peter's dome in the background, that installation was done under Benedict's reign. So this all happens when he gets kind of given this title, the Green Pope, because of his contributions to the ecological theology. And then Brian and I wondered when Benedict died if that title still held up, right? Like now that we have Francis to compare him to, would people still call him the Green Pope? And all the scholars we spoke to said yes, that if he had not kind of cleared the way and moved that needle forward, Francis wouldn't have been able to come in where he did and do what he has been doing. So then we get Francis, picking the name Francis to begin with, kind of being like maybe a foreshadowing, coming out in the simple white after being elected Pope, another sign of like the simple lifestyle. And a few years later, writing Laudato Si, right? One of the, I would venture to say, I don't have data to support this, but probably the most read encyclical outside of Catholicism. Well known, most well known and most read, respected by the scientific community. Like, this was a huge deal. And we can kind of see that's what he wanted, because he addressed it to every person on the planet. He cited non-Catholics in the footnotes, which I don't believe had ever been done before. And he also, to that point of kind of like upending the hierarchical power structures, he cited bishops' conferences from around the world who were talking about climate change. So it was really encouraging to me to see that thread of like justice issues being interwoven, that sharing of power, that recognizing that the bishops on the ground around the world had valuable information to contribute to the doctrine of the church on this, because typically an encyclical would only cite other popes, scripture, and prior encyclicals or prior church teaching. It would not typically cite bishops' conferences from around the world, or non-Catholics for that matter. So this was all part of Laudato Si, and we've kind of seen it lived out in the time since then. But in addition to Laudato Si, right, Francis didn't just write this document and then be like, okay, now this is like on the shelf as part of the church, which would have been still good, but even better is that he's really been putting it into practice. So the same year as Laudato Si came out, we see him designate September 1st as the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation, encourage Catholics to celebrate the season of creation with other ecumenical groups. He adds care for our common home to the works of mercy in the Catholic Church, along with adding ecological sin to the catechism. A few years ago, he launches the Laudato Si Action Platform, which is a 7-year initiative globally with 7 sectors the sectors are like universities, healthcare, dioceses, families, parishes, 7 sectors to look at the different ways that they can live out Laudato Si in their specific contexts. And he sets a goal for the Vatican City to become carbon neutral by 2050. Outside of just like, what are the Catholics doing? We see him influencing greater conversations about this. So when Laudato Si was released at a time when he knew it could influence the COP15 talks in Paris, which resulted in the Paris Agreement. In Ryan's story that he did for the 10th anniversary of Francis, he has quotes from the General Secretary at the time, Cristina Figueres, and she's saying like, that was huge. That was so helpful to have the moral weight of that document as they were going into the COP15 talks. And then just last year, the Vatican actually joined the Paris Agreement and joined the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which means they now get to have a vote and an official voice in these COP conversations that take place every year. So just a lot going on. It's really exciting to be able to report about it and talk to people about, what does this mean? So like around COP this year, the Vatican had their official delegation there. We're waiting to see what happens in years moving forward, what kind of influence they're going to have, how big their delegation might be or small. And it's really exciting from the Vatican level, from the global level, to see this focus, not just on the doctrine and prayer, but also on like real actionable items and influence. When I was asked to present tonight, I had kind of asked, like, should I focus on the US or should I focus globally? And that was because the conversation looks very different depending on which one of those we're looking at. We see dioceses around the world, bishops in certain countries really working together and putting together plans and implementing programs around Laudato Si with a lot of energy and a lot of specifics. I know like the Philippines, several countries in Northeastern Africa, places in South America are all doing like really concrete work on this collectively as bishops. And we don't see that level of priority or collaboration in the US right now. That's not to say there aren't certain bishops who are prioritizing it, but we don't see it collectively being taken up in the same way that we do some other areas. In the US, we see more either Catholic organizations that are lay-led or religious order-led really leading the way, as well as the universities. I think there's several Jesuit universities who have divested from fossil fuels with their finances. And the Catholic Sisters, we've recently had, there's so much that they've done even before all of this was getting the attention it does now, but we recently had a story about sisters in Kentucky with like over 600-acre conservation easement that they just, they're working with a conservancy to put that into a land trust. We just had a story earlier this week about sisters who are doing shareholder advocacy with Citibank and pipeline funding, and how it's affecting the indigenous communities that the pipelines run through. And the other thing we see is the way financial assets are being handled. So it's either like land assets, property assets, and financial assets are where we're really seeing more momentum, which is, I think, exciting because these are changes that kind of last in perpetuity, right? So it's not just like we're going to a park to clean up trash this weekend, which is a good thing to do. But I think somebody mentioned 350 earlier when we were chatting beforehand. So like Bill McKibben's newest venture is this third act where he's working with people who are retired and recognize that they maybe don't have the energy that more youthful movements do to go protest and march and rally, but what they do have is wealth. And so the whole thing the third act did a few weeks ago was recognizing that they're pulling their finances from the banks that are funding fossil fuel infrastructure and projects. And so I'm going to wrap up so we can move on to the next portion. But I would say when I look at the stories that are being pitched to me from writers, or that you know we're seeking to tell based on the press releases we receive and what's going on, that focus on for the Catholic Church in the US at least is really those assets. So it's like either the buildings, right? They have a lot of buildings that are empty or unused or underused. And so we had a story in January from 4 places across the country, for examples of buildings that are being either sold, repurposed, or renovated in sustainably minded ways by the church. And then we have stories about how the land is being used either for conservation, for biodiversity preservation, or other climate related issues. And then the wealth, are they divesting? There's an announcement this morning that 31 new faith organizations have divested from fossil fuels as of today.
Great.
Yes, great news. And so that story is on our website if anyone wants to read it. But you know, of those 31, most of them are not Catholic. The majority were Church of England in this particular announcement. And they made a point saying like, there are no US Catholic dioceses that have publicly divested. Where in the UK, half of the Catholic dioceses have publicly divested as of recently. And the Church of England's even higher. So I think there is a lot the church can do in the US on those fronts. And I hope we start seeing it happen personally, but we will report on it either way. And so that's just really encouraging that we're moving from important but very like short-term climate focuses like cleaning up a park to broader long-term things that will continue to benefit the world into the future, not just today. So, and all these stories I've mentioned are at earthbeat.org. And then just quickly, the two projects we have launching soon are, one is an interfaith biodiversity project with a group called Faiths at COP15, that we will have essays on how various faiths engage with the idea of biodiversity in their tradition. So those will be coming up soon. It's going to be called Many Faiths, One Planet. And then we also have some stories coming up that are solutions focused from an ecumenical cohort that I'm a part of with a few other religious publications. And so we're all going to be writing stories about things that churches are already doing that are effective in terms of sustainability. So there's things being done, small scale, large scale. You know, one of these stories may spark an idea for you in your parish or your diocese. So look for those coming up soon.
Stephanie, thank you so much for taking time to be with us tonight. We're grateful. If you have a question for Stephanie, if you just hold on to it, maybe write it down so you don't forget it. We'll come back at the end and do some Q&A. And right now I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Hammerman.
So thank you. That was such a stirring presentation. I really appreciate it. And it sort of brings out how this particular issue has the potential to unify us. I mean, there are a lot of horrible things about what's happening with our climate, but there's just a bit of optimism in how it brings people together. It brings faith groups together with a common cause. And it even, you know, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a rabbi as a representative in the sense of the Jewish people, although I hesitate always when someone says, what is the Jewish view on something? Because usually, you know, it's 2 Jews, 3 synagogues or whatever. I don't know if you have similar ideas. You know, the one synagogue no one's going to set foot in. But in this case, there is a lot of consensus in saving the planet. And theologically, there's a lot of consensus between, you know, there's no real difference between Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, different branches of Judaism. And so I want to share with you some of those areas of consensus, but also some of the key ways that we look at biblical texts and midrashic texts. Midrash is a Hebrew word, just means interpretations or commentaries on especially biblical texts. So in some ways, the New Testament, for instance, is a midrash on the Old Testament from a Christian perspective. Jews, we call it the Hebrew Bible. The midrash is the commentary on the Hebrew Bible. So we'll talk about a midrash. Let's go back to creation, to Adam and Eve. And first of all, the word Adam means earth. Adamah in Hebrew is earth. So when you think about that intimate connection between humanity and our planet, it starts with that name. Sort of like soil and soul, that they are nearly identical. Adam and Adamah, and Eve means life in Hebrew. So we have that connection right from the start. And there is a midrash that on the first day, the human beings were created. We're not going to talk about Genesis chapter 1 versus chapter 2. There are differences, whatever. But let's say the first 2 human beings are created and the sun sets. And they'd never seen a sunset. They'd never seen a sunrise. They'd never seen the sun do anything. So, of course, they panicked. Oh, my God, OMG. They figured that was probably the one who was talking to them. And oy vey, they probably said oy vey because that's what you say. The world is becoming dark. it's going to become void again, because that's the only history they had, that the world, the universe was without form and void. It's going back to that. Then the immediate conclusion that they drew was, we must have done this. It must be our fault. Jewish guilt was invented on that day. And they worried so much that they stayed up all night. They hadn't learned about sleep yet, I guess. And then the next morning, the dawn broke. And then they understood with such relief that this is the usual course of the world. This is the way things should be. So from the very first sunset, as darkness enveloped Adam and Eve, they experienced that guilt, that they'd somehow let God down, that it was somehow their fault, that they'd messed up this marvelous gift that they'd been given. And the Midrash then elaborates. God leads the human beings around the garden and says, look at my works. See how beautiful they are, how excellent. For your sake, I created them all. See to it that you do not spoil or destroy my world, for if you do, there will be no one to repair it after you. So that's what God tells Adam and Eve in this beautiful story, this beautiful Midrash. They were given the world's first garden tour, and they're warned, this is a beautiful world, but this is it. Don't mess this up, because if you do, there might be a time when the sun won't rise at the end of a cold, dark night. And if that happens, it will not be my fault, God says. It will be yours. Now, it's a folk tale, of course. It is a midrash, and it tells really less about what happened long ago. Generally speaking, we don't look at this in a literal sense, but it's talking about deep-seated Jewish values. And the punchline is that we have to take responsibility. The onus is on us. We break it, we own it. And we own our climate. We own our earth. We own our planet. We own our universe. We all know the damning statistics about sea level rise and what the 20 warmest years of recorded history have all occurred in the last, I think, 40 years. And it's been, as I was driving over here just now, because it's nice that we get the session that is tied into Earth Day. And so there's a lot of talk about the ice melting, that the 7 worst years for polar ice melting are in the last decade. So we all know just what we're up against, and we own it. I paid a lot of attention to what's going on in Israel, and aside from the political and all the other stuff happening there, was a flood last week, which almost never happens at this point in April. It's called a rainy season because that's when it rains. It rains in January, February, maybe into March, very rarely into April. And this was in the desert, in the Negev, in the south of the country. A couple was washed away by a flood, and unfortunately, they passed away. So this is pretty scary stuff. We all know that. It's not not anything new to any of us. So let me teach you a little about the High Holidays liturgy, Rosh Hashanah, which is called the birthday of the world. It is seen as the anniversary of creation. And we read in part of that liturgy how God remembers Noah. So, we've gone from the creation now to the Noah story, which of course really ties into creation and to the climate and to the earth and to the covenant, because that is where God establishes this covenant of the rainbow. And God says to Noah, or at least in this liturgy, V'zacharti et briti, God remembers the covenant. That's the first time that God and humanity entered into a partnership. That rainbow was the first covenant, the first contractual relationship, and it was about caring for the planet. So if there's anything that could indicate why this is such an important issue, it's that it goes all the way back to the beginning, before there was a Jewish people, before there were separate peoples. The Tower of Babel hadn't even happened yet. Separate languages. This was the one issue that everyone joined together. And the Great Flood, according to the Bible and to Jewish theology, was to be the last time that we could pin that kind of destruction on God. Again, this is sort of a repetition of our responsibility, our ownership. We are the custodians. The appearance of the rainbow marked a key moment in the human story. That's the instant when God turned the wheel over to us. That was the brit, the covenant that God pledged to remember. And I would contend that, a rabbi could be telling this story from the Bible, a preacher, a Bible-thumping preacher who takes the story maybe even a little more literally, but there's no disagreement about this. Noah's flood was God's doing. We all agree with that. But the text makes it clear that subsequent flood disasters would not be God's doing. God would never destroy the earth again. Run-of-the-mill thunderstorms, okay, maybe. But something like Superstorm Sandy, that's where we have to stand up and take notice. Now, that was just over a decade ago. And every part of this country now, basically every part of this world, has had an event, what we used to call an act of God. The insurance companies still do, but we can't call them that anymore. It's not God's fault. Our event here, and I don't know how many of you lived here at the time 10 years ago, but Sandy was that dividing line where beforehand, maybe we took it a little seriously, maybe not. Afterwards, we had to. I know that my congregation, Temple Bethel here in Stamford, established the state's largest solar panel field on our roof in the year following Sandy. So we did and one of the largest in the country at the time, because we had one of the largest roofs in the country. But, it was something that we felt we needed to do. One of those things that would happen after that kind of calamity, because we understood that God didn't flood the New York subways. God didn't submerge that roller coaster on the Jersey Shore. Hurricanes that happen, they happen, but this kind of thing we had never seen before. And we understood that the costs of inaction are undeniable, and that the evidence, the scientific evidence, was only growing, and that we were all now Adam on that first night, Adam and Eve, seeing it get dark and wondering whether the sun would come up again. We shouldn't have had to wait till Sandy. I mean, Hurricane Katrina should have done it for us. The great tsunami in Asia should have, awakened us when we saw Japanese soccer balls, coming ashore in Washington State. We should have understood the crippling blizzards, the cataclysmic tornadoes. We all know about these things. One thing that happened after Sandy is that I felt comfortable giving a sermon like this. Mm-hmm. I don't know about other clergy, but I always was concerned about giving a climate sermon. I felt, especially on the high holidays, I try not to get too political. My congregants are laughing right now, but you sort of don't want to go there. And this was seen as somehow politically controversial. And the other thing is that it was somewhat irrelevant to people's day-to-day lives, at least in their own minds. Heaven can wait. We have other priorities, they would say. But now we understand that heaven and earth can't wait. It matters to each of us. It reaches the core of our being, and there is consensus. That has become our new normal. I don't know about you, but when there's a storm now, they're increasingly violent and vicious, and the earth, which we saw as such a friendly environment for us to be in this part of the country, up here in Connecticut, it's so beautiful in the spring. It's so scary now to go out during a storm, because you just don't have that assuredness, that the sun is going to come up in the morning. We have that feeling that Adam and Eve had on that first night. God is not in that still small voice as much anymore. We have to try to get the sacred clues out of the howling winds and the crashing waves and understand that we have work to do. we lost, a lot of people lost power after Sandy. Somehow in my congregation at Temple Bethel, we didn't lose power. So we had congregants coming and recharging their batteries and having food. And, we gave them hot meals and people from the community came. It was wonderful. Someone came up to me that week and said, can we do this more often? And I said, unfortunately, we will have to, I think. So let me give you a few more Jewish concepts that will be helpful. One is that the Hebrew word for wind is the same as the Hebrew word for spirit, ruach. So in Judaism, the meteorological and the spiritual are deeply intertwined. And the experience of a storm is profoundly spiritual. Even in our day, the ancients, of course, felt that way, but we do as well. The weather is one of the few things left that reduces us to mush in the face of its power. It makes us realize how insignificant we really are. Except, and here is the message that I think is reinforced by my tradition and others, is that we aren't. We are not insignificant. Feeling small is a cop-out. And where religion makes a huge difference is bringing people together, as this does, but also empowering us. That we do have responsibility, that we can't just succumb to the fear, that we need to overcome it instead. The Torah states that the iniquities of the parents have an impact on the third and fourth generations. And I know that among some Native Americans, that even goes beyond to the seventh generation. The environmental activist Nigel Savage wrote, "You could argue that the Jewish people have been thinking about sustainable energy ever since God spoke to Moses out of a bush that burned but was never consumed. Moses was perhaps the first environmentalist. He recycled his staff into a snake, got Egypt to turn off its lights for 3 days, and convinced an entire nation to go on a 40-year nature hike. And the Maccabees took a small cruse of oil and stretched it out for 8 miraculous nights. If Moses could do it, if the Maccabees could do it, so must we." The Torah's basic value of conservation is from the book of Deuteronomy. It's derived from, of all things, the rules of warfare. It's called Bal Tashchit in Hebrew. It means do not destroy. And you might remember the commandment there is that when you besiege a city, you shouldn't cut down the fruit trees around the city, because as it says in the Bible, are trees human that you would besiege them too? So that the trees shouldn't suffer for the sins of the people. And of course, also, it's not to waste a precious resource that could be used, even in a utilitarian sense, could be used by the invading army to feed themselves and to build houses or whatever later on. So they were not allowed to cut down those fruit trees, which is fine in and of itself, but it was expanded by the Talmudic rabbis to include all manner of waste, anything that would be considered wasteful, even wasting food. That's again where the Jewish guilt comes in. Those kids in Israel need to eat. Why are you wasting your food? Whatever. We should not waste. That's a prime Torah value. Again, a consensus among Jewish groups, all denominations, that we should live in harmony with nature. Let me add one more thing that I think is significant. This week is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Earth Day almost always falls right sort of back to back. This is the Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Day. There's a universal one in January. This is the day, yesterday actually, when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. That's why it's marked in Israel and around the Jewish world. 80 years ago, in fact, this year, 80 years ago. And I think there is a connection between remembering the Holocaust and this issue. I remember years ago, I visited the site of Dachau concentration camp just outside of Munich. And I say the site of Dachau because it wasn't really Dachau. It was, yes, there was the infamous inscription Arbeit macht frei and the big arch of work will bring freedom, barbed wire, and there were barracks recreated. But it was beautiful. It was totally replanted. And yes, there were memorials to the dead, and we knew that underneath there were ashes and there were people buried. But the flowers were so beautiful. There was fresh cut grass. I could hear birds. I even saw a butterfly, which is somewhat ironic since there's a famous Holocaust poem about no butterflies being in the death camps. This wasn't hell, but then what was it? Why was it looking so lovely and so natural? Was this a cruel trick by God, a vain attempt to reclaim that which God had ceded to the beast in humanity? Or was this God's apology, a smattering of forget-me-nots and daisies embedded in cemetery sod, a plea for forgiveness, even though too little, too late? Or maybe God was hoping beyond hope to give all of us one last chance to regain the illusion of an attainable paradise on earth, a thin veneer of April hope covering the reality of August hell. Here God is telling us, I can't give you redemption. All I can give you is this spring-like illusion. Let it ease the pain of your wanderings. Take it. On Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, we say to God that this plan, however comforting and kind, can't possibly work. We reject the illusion. We've seen hell firsthand. It won't be forgotten. Time won't heal that wound. If renewal is possible following the Holocaust, a God who is absent during it can't bring it about. God, who could not save the Jews, will also not redeem the earth. If renewal and hope are at all possible, only human beings can facilitate it. And this takes me to two seemingly contradictory verses in Psalms. Psalm 24 tells us the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. While we read in Psalm 115, the heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth has been given to humankind. There's a discrepancy here, but it can be resolved this way. Once upon a time, the earth was the Lord's, but since the hell that happened in the Holocaust, it is ours and ours alone. We now have to be the ones to reclaim the earth, just as we have to save humanity. We can't count on anyone else to do it for us. We understand that we can look to heaven for strength and comfort and resolve, but the earth has been given to humankind. And the blood of our brother Abel is screaming from that very earth. And his father and mother, Adam and Eve, are once again shaking with fear. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Hammerman.
Thank you.
We will take a few minutes here for questions and answers. Why don't you just stay up here and
Yeah.
and so if you have a question for Stephanie or for Rabbi Hammerman, online or in person, let's hear it.
I have a question for Stephanie.
Okay, Linda has a question for Stephanie.
Stephanie, what can you tell us about the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and any efforts that they may be making to help save the enemy?
Were you able to hear that, Stephanie?
Yes, I was actually. I was going to say you must have a really good mic because I could hear that perfectly. You know, I don't know a lot about Bridgeport specifically. I know that there are some pretty active climate groups in Maryland. I'm trying to think if I have any specific stories from Bridgeport. There's not any coming to mind, but what I would say is most places have a, there's two different groups that have like satellite groups all around. So the Catholic Climate Covenant is like under the USCCB, so the US Bishops Conference. They are kind of their climate arm. And so they have like green teams, or I think they're called creation care teams, all over the place. So I would be willing to bet there was one in Connecticut. And the other group, which is global, is the Laudato Si movement, formerly was called the Global Catholic Climate Movement. And they also have lots of different levels of groups with different focuses all over the place. So I would reach out to those organizations if you're trying to find out what's going on in your area, and they would be able to tell you most likely. I also think I don't know if it's in the Diocese of Bridgeport, but I believe the Sisters of Mercy have like an eco retreat center in Connecticut. I forget where, but I'd be happy to send that afterwards when I can look it up.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think there's a story there for you.
Okay.
I think there's a story you need to follow up.
I see online, John has a hand up. So John, your question?
Yeah, this is kind of a Josh, but Stephanie can also address it. Josh, you your synagogue has been recognized by Interfaith Power and Light organization, which is a national org run out of California. And actually, you were partly the inspiration when we did the St. John's solar installation. I applied last year finally for what we had done, and we're smaller than you, but we're recognized on that. And one of the points I'm trying to make, and I talked to your CFO, is there's not a lot of churches in Connecticut or Fairfield County or New England that have done solar projects. And one of the points is they're not necessarily all educated or have the staff or people to figure out how to go about it, the financing and everything. And so my question is, and this is kind of in the action domain, is there something collectively we can be doing through these organizations? And you're on an advisory board of what is it called? I got to look it up again. It's a Connecticut
Interreligious Eco Justice.
Interfaith Justice. And my question is, it seems it's an organization. Is it a useful one to try to corral and turn us into doing something positive of these, bigger types of projects and helping other church and faith and community organizations?
Yeah, we were very lucky. This was back in 2012, again, right after Sandy. So we were really attuned to the issue, and we had a congregant who was working in this area. So he stood to gain a little bit from the project, but it wasn't done for personal, benefit. The state was also at that time giving huge incentives, right. I believe still is.
Yep.
Back now, I think, nationally, we're more on board with that. So in the end, it was an easy financial decision for our board, which doesn't necessarily mean they didn't believe in the broader principle, which I'm sure they did. But if you can also save a lot of money on our energy costs, it's a great incentive to do it. Also, we had to redo our roof, which was about ready to happen. By the way, one of the huge advantages we have is that we don't have a steeple. It's a lot easier when you have a flat roof to do this, and we had a large. It was just very conducive to a project like this. But the economic incentives were key, and there's no reason it can't save a little bit of money to do something good. So
we did.
It's a win-win.
That was the driving thing for us. But the point is, there are other organizations. Actually, one of our former congregants is now in a council of church further up in Connecticut, and he contacted me a few months ago saying, "How do we go about looking at this? We need help as a council." Right? He's like the only kind of experienced, I'd say, finance guy on it. And so it was actually a question of, is there a collective group kind of effort that could be put into helping these New England organizations, including schools, address this? You've got the philosophy of what's good to be doing, but you've also got to address the economics, right? Nobody's gonna do it, and if they're not capable of doing it, like this guy is saying, is there something to do? So I'm curious about that organization, the interfaith, not the national one, but
Interreligious Echo Justice. That's
Yes.
Very active in Connecticut and does a lot of work up in Hartford, governmentally.
it's
So
much more
really-
Hartford oriented, it seems.
Yeah, that would be the best way to go. But you can also call our executive director again. They might, we haven't done this in a few years, so it really pays to be up to date on what exactly needs to be done. But it's not that hard.
That's what I was saying. So is there something that a group could pull together and kind of advocate and promote, because this is at least a receptive audience. It should be.
When I was in when I worked in the diocese in Vermont, we partnered with a local energy company to conduct energy audits on our parishes. So the parish had to opt in, but we basically set up all of the framework for them from the diocese. And so this energy company would come in and do an energy audit on their parish buildings or school or whatever. And kind of say, does it make sense for you to get solar? Or is your insulation so terrible that would not be a good use of your money? And so they would then suggest a span of projects that parish should consider to increase their energy sustainability, from low money to high money. And then the parish actually in Vermont, the Vermont chapter of Interfaith Power and Light offered grants. So then they could take the results of that audit to IPL and say, could we get a grant to do this project? And I was on the board at IPL, and they always said yes. So
IPL actually funds projects. I was not aware of that.
They might. So the way the locals chapters work are all a little bit different. It's not standardized, but there are local chapters, I think, in just about every state. So it's somewhere to look for potential funding. The other thing I just wanted to say is Catholic Climate Covenant has a program called Catholic Energies, which is specifically designed to do what you're saying, help parishes figure it out. And especially right now, to help them understand how to take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act credits they can get to put in renewable energy this year. So, I mean, it's designed for Catholic parishes, but I'm sure they would be able to offer helpful information in terms of what to look at or what to consider.
Thank you. Thank you both of you. Thanks, John. John in person had a question.
I've got a question for Stephanie. It's my understanding that the Catholic Church is either the largest or among the largest land and building owners in the world. And it's also my understanding that buildings are responsible for about 40% of the carbon generated globally. And without higher performing buildings, we can't solve this problem. Can you help us have a better understanding for where Laudato Si comes in terms of perhaps actioning steps to help the Catholic Church retrofit buildings or create buildings?
Sure, yeah. It is also my understanding that the Catholic Church is one of, if not the biggest landholder. And it's something that I've been, pondering how we can do more stories about it, to better serve our readers. But one thing to keep in mind is Laudato Si is written for the global church. So it doesn't really get into specifics about what to do, because our buildings here are going to be very different than buildings in some of the other areas of the world that Laudato Si is also written for. So it doesn't give specifics, but actually a part of Laudato Si that I find really compelling, I once got to interview a Jesuit urban planner about this, is about how we build our cities, and how we should be designing them, or when we're fixing parts of them, doing it in a way that has ecology in mind. We've seen a lot in our recent years with the big heat waves about these what do they call it? They're areas of cities that get super, super hot because of all the concrete, and there's no green space. There's nothing to absorb the heat. And, then this becomes not just a climate issue, but this is a health issue. This is typically those communities without green spaces are already disadvantaged communities. And so it talks about the way we lay out not just a building, but a city, a town, and that we should be doing that with ecology and other areas of justice in mind. A few things that are happening with buildings, though, this is a story from just this January, is like, so at Rockhurst University, they took the oldest building on campus, and they just refurbished it to be the most eco-friendly building on campus. Rockhurst is in Kansas City. And so they did this through repurposing some of the stone that was the structure, because when you demolish stone, you release carbon that was embedded in it. And it can actually be pretty significant. So it's not just that they're repurposing it like in a recycling way, but that they're actually keeping that carbon contained. They used glass in a way to heat and cool it efficiently. So refurbishing old buildings is one way. In the Diocese of Seattle, they are selling off a bunch of their buildings to a developer who is whose goal is to develop net zero communities. So they're specifically selling to that developer because that developer promises to develop in a net zero way. In Vermont, there was a parish center that burned down from a lightning strike. And when they rebuilt it, they did this like incredible kitchen that was built to like the highest eco standards. And then anyone who rents out that building, like they kind of rent it out as a community center, they have to sign off on like, we will use compostable materials. We will use like the high efficiency dish dryer or whatever. So they're like spreading that knowledge, and like in Vermont, there's like a really great program for learning about composting. So they have that to their advantage, but yeah, it's a combination. I think you have to look at the specific building, where it is, what it is or isn't being used for anymore, and like what the needs of the community are. The fourth building in that story was an old monastery in New York. And not only did they renovate the building sustainably, but the whole way it operates, they rethought to really make it a center of support for that community, and bring people in, that whole idea like interconnectedness and working together, going beyond just like the green aspects, but to make it really a community place. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a recognition that buildings are not being utilized financially smart or sustainably, but kind of to the point about the solar, like the pastors don't always know what to do. And so finding the way to get the resources they need to them is where I think there's a big, like a break in the communication.
Thank you very much. We just have time for one last question, and my friend right here is gonna ask it. Okay.
I want to comment on Stephanie.
Okay.
The Laudato, there are 27 Jesuit schools in the United States. One of them is Loyola, Maryland. What they do there is twofold. They are a Laudato Si, and as of yesterday, Fordham was about to join them because I'm saying we got to do something. It's a 7-year program. They have to have someone in charge. They have to have a spiritual dimension. They have to have management and a financial dimension, but it's also educational. So if you, my son went to Maryland. So if you give money, you can have half of it go towards building trees, putting sunroofs, etc. And the other half you do for the students. You provide students with scholarships if they're going to major or minor in environmental studies. As of yesterday, we're going to do that at Fordham. Now, I'm saying this because you don't have to be Catholic. Most of you probably have an alma mater. Jewish people have an alma mater.
Yeah.
You can even call and connect with Loyola, Maryland, and find out what they're doing, because I know they've already got it started. So anybody's got a college, you don't even a high school. You know, those are the kind of things you can pass on, just imitating what somebody else has done. You don't have to be Catholic.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. That's very,
Great.
okay, that's all the time that we have tonight. We are so thankful for everybody who's gathered together online and here in person. So thankful for Stephanie and for Rabbi Hammerman. It's been a really helpful evening, and blessings on you. Go in peace.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hello.